Hi there, my name's Gavin Jack and I'm Professor of Management at the Business School at La Trobe University here in Australia. I'm here today to talk with my colleague Neville Bell.
Hello Gavin, how are you?
Hi there, very well, thank you. And our topic today is the work of Geert Hofstede, who'll be a name that's well known to many of you who study international and cross-cultural management in particular. His book Culture's Consequences, which was published in 1980, has been and continues to be a major text for research within the cross-cultural domain of international management. And what we want to do today is to talk through some of the issues that we believe are problems with Hofstede's framework and some of the ways in which we can perhaps more critically appreciate it and continue to use it into the future. Neville, thanks for taking the time to talk today. I'd like to start by asking you, in the light of the fact that there are quite a few criticisms to be made of Hofstede's framework, what do you think is it that he's really brought to bear in our understandings of culture?
I think that's a good question, Gavin. I think that we have to first of all have a think about when he did his research. He started collecting data back in IBM back in the 1960s, and it was the early 70s that he analysed that data. And so a lot of his research we've got to think of in the context of the time when he actually started that work. He's actually contributed some very important things to the field. I think first and foremost, he's introduced this approach of cross-cultural research on a multinational scale within multinational organisations and between cultures. And his approach to that research has set really a model that's been followed by a lot of subsequent research. That's been very important, a very important contribution. I think the other very important contribution from Hofstede is that some of the concepts that he refined still are very valid today, and they provide us a lot of insight to culture. And so, for example, his constructs of power distance within cultures is a very valid one. So that's the extent with which people in a society accept a power differential within the society. Certainly his construct of uncertainty avoidance is a very powerful one. My wife, for example, has a very high uncertainty avoidance. She likes everything just well defined. I myself am far more relaxed. I don't mind if things are a bit loose. So that's a very important construct. And of course, perhaps the most important construct that Hofstede refined was this concept of collectivism and individualism. And that also today is a very powerful concept. What Hofstede did, of course, though, is that he generated a set of scales or numbers or numeric results for different cultures. And it's those that we've got to be, in particular, a little bit careful in how we apply.
Mm-hmm. So could you just say a little bit more about that? What do you think, what are these indicators or these numbers, these mean scores that are attributed to different cultures? What do they represent? Do you think that they say something useful about culture and international business?
Yes, I think, first of all, we should understand societies and the different levels of societies that we can look at. At the bottom level, there's the micro level, so the individuals, you and I. At the next level up is the meso level, so that's the level of organisations, or maybe a village or other group within the culture, subgroup within the culture. And then, of course, there's the macro level where you're looking at the whole culture. Now, Hofstede drew his research from IBM managers around the world at the time. That was where his original data came from. And essentially, IBM represented a meso group within those cultures. It was clearly also influenced by IBM's own internal organisational culture. But the questions we then have to ask ourselves is that he measured these on these dimensions. He came up with scores. But back in the 60s, how many women managers did IBM employ? Possibly not so many. So therefore, how representative are those results to the women in those societies, for example? How representative are they to non-professional people, to the arts side of society and other areas in the society? And so Hofstede selected data from a very select meso group within that society. And we've got to be a little bit careful how we apply that data across other levels within the society.
I suppose it's also fair to say that we should be careful about what we infer from some of the results that were generated. There's a recent piece by Alfredo Behrens which looks at the Uruguayan scores, particularly for uncertainty avoidance. And he makes the point that at the time that data were collected, Uruguay was in a difficult macroeconomic situation, and a number of Uruguayans were fleeing the economy at that particular time, trying to find jobs overseas. And also at that time, therefore, IBM jobs were highly prized. So there was considerable uncertainty and anxiety in the environment at that particular point. So the question you could then raise is whether or not Uruguayans, who had scored high on the uncertainty avoidance dimension, were really reflecting an underlying cultural value, or whether they were responding to a particular set of economic circumstances. Yeah.
And indeed that's true. Economics, politics, religion, all of those things will have an influence and impact upon culture and people's responses to these types of questions. I think the other thing that we have to look at as well is that if you have a look in any culture, there'll be a distribution, and the distribution curve will peak where there's a tendency in that culture. So with the Uruguayans, there was obviously a tendency towards higher uncertainty avoidance. But more recent research has shown that indeed as much as 92% of diversity can occur within a culture. And of course one of the difficulties then becomes is that if I'm dealing with you, I have no idea where you are on that distribution. And so from that point of view, you may have a very low uncertainty avoidance, even though your culture has a high uncertainty avoidance. And so we have to be very careful when we take those results and apply them at an individual level.
Picking up on the culture concept then, it's clearly an idea that has a lot of resonance and interest across a number of disciplines, notably anthropology, also sociology, politics, and more recently business studies too. And what it seems that's happened with Hofstede's work and those that have replicated his research design is that the culture concepts become something of a scientific object. And with that come a number of assumptions about how culture works and what culture is. Could you just say a bit about what you understand those assumptions to be?
I think that's another very important point for us to keep in mind. When Hofstede was considering culture, and again, this was in the early days in the research of culture, so our understanding of culture at that time was still a little bit limited. But the assumption was made that culture was solely based on values within the culture. And of course, culture is actually somewhat, as we've found, more complex than that, more sophisticated. And that culture has cultural norms. It has other influences that also affect how people behave and respond to things. And so to make the assumption that culture as a construct is just based on values, valid at the time, but now that we have a better understanding of culture and a more detailed or nuanced understanding of what culture is made up of, values form an important part, but perhaps not all. I think the other assumption that was made at the time, and again, reasonable at the time, but we've subsequently found different, is that culture is very stable. Hofstede was of the opinion that culture was extremely stable and didn't change over time. Again, if we put that in context, if you have a think about when he did his research, the world wasn't as globalised as it is today. Communication wasn't as it is today. There wasn't as much interaction as there is today. And so perhaps culture was a little bit more stable then, but we have subsequently found that indeed culture evolves. And in particular, it evolves on a generational basis. And for example, you've got young nephews and nieces, and I'm sure you've seen how some of their values, some of their approaches and understanding of life is quite different to ours. And so each generation evolves the culture a little bit further. And that, of course, is influenced by wars, by politics, by religion, but recently, importantly, by technology and the internet. Look at young kids today and technology and internet and Facebook and how they're absorbing that into their culture. And so this assumption that culture is stable was also has been shown to be not quite the case. Hofstede also took the view that cultures tended to cluster, and that is that people of a particular culture tended to live in one area, live together. But if you have a look at the Chinese diaspora around the world today, there are strong Chinese communities in most countries of the world. And indeed, you've got to then ask the question, are the Chinese that are living in America, do they have some sort of American culture, or are they still representative of the Chinese culture? Now, there's a very useful rule of thumb that we can use here, in that culture is really closely linked to your mother tongue, to your native tongue. And so those peoples that go to live in another country, if they retain their mother language, means that they're still thinking in the constructs and concepts of that language, still seeing the world through those constructs, then the chances are that they're still representative of the original culture. And so in the modern world today, if we talk about the Italian culture, we've got Italians all around the world that comprise part of that culture. The other assumption that was made, which again was possibly valid back then, was that geography defined culture. Today, perhaps the only country, well, there's a couple of countries, I guess one might argue that North Korea, which is a closed country, that North Korean culture is contained geographically. Japanese culture is reasonably contained geographically. But look at Australia. You know, we're multicultural. We have lots of different active cultures. If you look at the mother tongues, we have a lot of European tongues, a lot of Asian tongues. Our Aboriginals have over 180 living languages. So we're very, very culturally diverse. And geography no longer defines culture at all. And so these underlying assumptions we've discovered in subsequent years, perhaps we've refined them, understood them in a different way.
Mm-hmm. I'm picking up on the point you just made about Indigenous communities and Australian Indigenous knowledge. It points to the importance of thinking about culture also in terms of politics and the relationship between different cultural groupings and their knowledge systems. And that would certainly be something that, if you were thinking more critically about the culture concept, that you'd want to bring in. And of course, since the original study from 1980, Hofstede himself has updated his dimensions with a view more recently. I think we're up to 6, possibly 7 dimensions. But given the assumptions that you've articulated about the culture concept through Hofstede and some of the issues with it, do you think it still has analytical purchase? And do you think that broader or other examples of values typologies, that there's something that we can take from that and continue to work with in our studies?
Hofstede's work has been very important and is still very important. One of the words you just used there worry me a little bit. You used the word analytical. One of the difficulties with Hofstede is you can go to his website and he'll tell you a score for America for individualism. He'll tell you a score for China on that same scale. I'm not sure that we can take those scores absolutely. I think that if we use them as tendencies within the culture, then it's useful. But coming back to a point I made earlier in our chat, those constructs that Hofstede has developed or refined are still very powerful. They're very powerful in understanding culture and allowing us to sort of have some empathy with the culture. So they're very important in that respect. In regards to his dimensions and the values on his dimensions, if we just use them at a macro level and as a tendency, then I think that they do provide some reasonable comparison. So by way of example, recent research has shown that countries with a higher power distance have a higher whisky consumption. Interestingly, countries with a higher uncertainty avoidance have a higher bottled water consumption. It's understandable why that is so. And so at that level, at that sort of macro comparative level, I think Hofstede's work still can provide us good and meaningful insight into cultural differences.
Neville, thanks very much for sharing your insights with us today. We hope that you found that a useful conversation in terms of thinking a bit about the detail and the underpinnings of Hofstede's framework, and that it would encourage you to think critically about not just his original study, but whether or not we can continue to apply it in our research on international and cross-cultural management. Thanks for watching.